an original story narrated exclusively for love beyond words. She had been carrying the secret for 12 days when the first crack appeared in the life she had been trying so hard to hold together. 12 days since she had stood alone in the small washroom beside the guest chamber, hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the test into the basin, staring at the faint second line until it darkened enough to stop being hope and become truth. Pregnant. The word had not arrived in her heart as fear first. It had arrived as wonder, a quiet, almost sacred wonder that made the room seem too small to contain it. She had pressed a hand to her mouth and sat on the closed lid of the toilet and cried without making a sound, because she did not know yet whether the tears were joy or grief or some dangerous mixture of both. She only knew that a life had begun inside her, and that from that moment onward she was no longer only herself. Every thought had changed shape around that knowledge. Every silence in her marriage had become heavier. Every look from her husband had become something she measured, weighed, and carried away like evidence in a trial that had not yet begun. Her name was Eliza Ashford, and if anyone had looked at her from the outside, they might have called her fortunate. Her husband was handsome in the polished, respectable way that made strangers trust him immediately. Daniel Ashford spoke gently in public, remembered names, opened doors, laughed at the right moments, and had built a career that made older men clap him on the shoulder and say he had a good head on him. They lived in a beautiful house with tall windows and pale stone steps, the sort of house that looked warm from the street even when the people inside it were slowly freezing to death. They had been married 3 years. In photographs, they seemed composed, elegant, enviable. But photographs never caught the long pauses after dinner, the way Daniel's face emptied when guests left, or the private chill that settled over him the instant he no longer had to perform being affectionate. Eliza had spent much of her marriage learning how to live around absences that wore the shape of a person still standing in the room. There had been no great betrayal at first, no loud cruelty, nothing dramatic enough to explain to others. There had only been the steady drip of being unseen, a hand withdrawn too soon, a conversation ended too quickly, a husband who kissed her forehead instead of her mouth and said he was tired and turned away before she could answer. Loneliness did not always begin with abandonment. Sometimes it began with a marriage bed that grew cold 1 inch at a time. When she found out she was pregnant, she had not told him immediately because she wanted one perfect moment before reality reached it. She wanted to believe, just for a few days, that this child might be the soft, bright thing that turned their lives back toward each other. Not because she was foolish enough to think a baby could fix a broken marriage, but because hope is hardest to kill when it comes wrapped in innocence. She had imagined telling him over dinner, or perhaps on one of the rare evenings when he came home before dark and seemed almost like the man she had married. She had pictured the pause, the disbelief, then his face changing with sudden emotion. She had let herself imagine his hand covering hers. She had even imagined him smiling in that open, astonished way he used to years ago, before everything between them became careful and thin. She knew she was building a fragile dream out of scraps, but when a woman has been starving emotionally for long enough, she can make a feast out of crumbs. The secret changed her. She walked more carefully. She ate with more attention. She slept with one hand over her stomach without meaning to. She began speaking silently to the life inside her, not in words at first, but in promises shaped by feeling. Stay. Please stay. I'll protect you. I'll figure this out. She found herself standing in the nursery they had once laughed about renovating someday, her fingertips brushing the dusty windowsill, imagining pale curtains and sunlight and the small, astonished sounds of an infant waking into the world. It hurt that imagining. It hurt because it was tender, and tenderness had become dangerous in that house. Daniel noticed her distraction only enough to ask one evening whether she was unwell. She looked at him across the table, candlelight resting warmly on his face, and nearly told him then. The words rose to her lips. "I'm pregnant." But something stopped her. Something in the flatness of his eyes, in the way he kept checking his phone between bites, in the way his question sounded more like obligation than concern. She said it was only fatigue. He nodded, relieved by the simplicity of it, and returned to his messages. There were signs she should have taken more seriously. Late meetings that became overnight business dinners. A new caution around his phone. The way he stepped out to take calls and came back wearing a face too neutral, to be honest. Eliza noticed all of it, because women notice far more than they're ever given credit for, but she had grown so used to suppressing what she knew that even suspicion felt like disloyalty. She told herself not to become one of those wives who look for betrayal everywhere. She told herself marriage demanded patience, demanded trust, demanded the kind of grace that often looks suspiciously like self-erasure. Besides, she was pregnant now. She did not want stress. She did not want conflict. She wanted peace, even false peace, because the truth already felt sharp enough to wound two hearts instead of one. On the evening, everything changed. The house was full of rain. It slid down the long windows in silver streaks and tapped against the glass with the soft persistence of fingertips asking to be let in. Daniel had returned home early for the first time in weeks, and that alone made her pulse quicken with possibility. He came in smelling of wet wool and expensive cologne, loosened his tie, and gave her a distracted kiss on the cheek. But there was something else in him, too, some restless current beneath the surface. He moved through the rooms as if waiting for someone. When the doorbell rang 20 minutes later, he answered it before the maid could, and Eliza, standing in the breakfast room with one hand around a teacup, heard a woman's voice in the hall. Warm, low, familiar. Her stomach tightened instinctively before her mind caught up. The visitor was Mary Ann Cole, Daniel's business partner's sister, or so she had always been introduced. Mary Ann had attended 2 dinners at their home in the past year, both times arriving in soft cashmere and the kind of self-possession that drew attention without seeming to ask for it. She was beautiful, though not in the fragile or decorative way people praised in women to diminish them. Mary Ann looked like a woman who knew exactly how rooms changed when she entered them. Eliza had noticed once, during dessert at one of those dinners, how Daniel laughed differently at Mary Ann's remarks than he did at anyone else's. More quickly, more freely. She had noticed the way Mary Ann touched his sleeve as if it were natural. She had noticed a silence between them that did not feel empty, but crowded with things unspoken. And because she was a decent woman who still wished to believe the best, she had looked away from what she noticed and named it nothing. Now, that same voice drifted down the corridor with the rain behind it. "We need to talk now," Mary Ann said, not loudly, but with the tone of someone accustomed to being heard. Eliza did not intend to eavesdrop. If anyone had asked her later, she would have said she was on her way to the front hall to welcome a guest. That would have been true in part. But the second truth was sharper. Something in the air had already begun to sting. She moved quietly, tea forgotten on the sideboard, and reached the drawing room door just as it closed almost fully. Not latched, just mostly shut, enough to suggest privacy, enough to leave a narrow opening by the frame. She should have turned away. She knew that. The decent version of herself, the disciplined wife, the woman she had been trained to be, told her plainly to leave. But then Daniel spoke, and the sound of his voice stopped her cold. There was strain in it, and guilt. "You shouldn't have come here." Mary Ann answered, "You weren't answering my calls. Because this is getting out of hand." A silence followed, then the rustle of movement, the soft scrape of a chair. Eliza stood motionless in the dim corridor, the pulse in her neck suddenly violent. The baby. Her first panic thought was not even about infidelity. It was that stress was dangerous, that she should breathe, that she must not faint. She placed one hand against the wall to steady herself and listened to the rain beating more harshly against the windows. Mary Ann's voice came again, lower this time, edged with hurt. "Out of hand? That's what you call this now. What would you like me to call it?" "The truth, Daniel." Then he said the 5 words that would divide Eliza's life into before and after. "I can't leave my wife." He did not shout them. He did not spit them with resentment or say them with noble sorrow. He said them with exhausted frustration, like a man cornered by consequences he had hoped someone else would manage for him. Eliza felt the blood drain so quickly from her face that for a second the hallway seemed to tilt. The words themselves were devastating enough, but it was the way they carried the whole hidden architecture of betrayal inside them that nearly undid her. Not "I love my wife." Not "this was a mistake." Not "I choose my marriage." Only "I can't leave my wife." A confession and a complaint in the same breath. A sentence that admitted everything while preserving his self-pity. He had wanted to leave. He had considered it. He had discussed it. Her marriage was not a wounded thing struggling to survive. It had been standing at the edge of abandonment while she slept beside him with a hand over the child he did not know existed. Marian laughed then, but there was nothing amused in it. "Can't or won't. Does it matter? It matters to me. It should have mattered to you before this started." "Oh, don't do that." Marianne's voice sharpened. "Do not stand there and pretend I drag you into this. You told me you were miserable. You told me she barely knew you. You told me the marriage was dead." Eliza closed her eyes. Each sentence landed like a blow precisely because it contained pieces of truth she recognized. Miserable. Barely knew you. Marriage dead. Had he said those things? Perhaps. Had she felt their shadows already? Certainly. But it is one thing to suffer inside a marriage and another to hear your private pain used as a love letter to someone else. Daniel exhaled harshly. "I was angry. You were honest. I was reckless. You were in love with me." The silence that followed was so long that Eliza heard every individual drop of rain ticking against the glass. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard settled. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock marked the quarter hour. Then Daniel spoke, and his next words were quieter, more dangerous for that. Maybe I was. Eliza pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. Her body had gone cold, but under the cold was something fiercer beginning to rise. Not yet strength, not yet clarity, just the first terrible heat of being broken open. Inside her, a child the size of a seed floated in complete innocence while its mother learned that her husband had almost given their life away. Marian said something after that, but Eliza barely heard it. Her ears were roaring. She stepped back too quickly and brushed the edge of a porcelain umbrella stand in the hallway. It rocked with a small clatter, not loud, but enough. The drawing room door flew open almost immediately. Daniel stood there, face stripped of color. Marianne was behind him, one hand gripping the back of a chair, her expression shifting from anger to alarm as she saw Eliza in the hall. For one suspended second, none of them spoke. Eliza saw everything at once with a clarity so brutal it felt merciful. Daniel's guilt, Marianne's knowledge, the whole shameful geometry of the triangle in which she had been the only blind point. Then Daniel said her name as if it were a plea. "Eliza." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man she had married, but the man he had become when he thought she was not listening. "Don't," she said, and her own voice startled her with its steadiness. "Not one word. Not yet." Marianne straightened, collecting herself with visible effort. To her credit or her cowardice, Eliza could not tell which. She did not attempt excuses. She only said, very softly, "I didn't know you were there." Eliza turned to her with a smile, so thin it almost hurt. "No, I imagined both of you were relying on that." Daniel moved toward her then, hands half raised as if calming a frightened animal. "Please let me explain." "Explain what?" she asked. "Which part would you like to explain first? The affair? The lies? The part where you almost left me? Or the part where I had to hear it in a hallway like a stranger in my own home?" Marian flinched. Daniel's face tightened. "It's over." Eliza laughed once, a sound so sharp even she barely recognized it. What a generous comfort. He reached for her arm. She stepped back before he could touch her. The movement was instinctive, immediate. She would remember that later more clearly than anything else. The body knowing before the mind had finished grieving. "Do not put your hands on me," she said. Marianne gathered her coat from the arm of the chair. "I should go." "Yes," Eliza replied without looking at her. "You should have done that months ago." Marianne paused as if she might say something more, perhaps in defense, perhaps an apology, but whatever she saw in Eliza's face stopped her. She left without another word, the front door closing behind her with a heavy finality that seemed to ripple through the entire house. Daniel and Eliza were alone then, though the house no longer felt like theirs. Rain pressed against the windows. The fire in the drawing room had burned low, leaving only embers. Daniel stood a few feet away, helpless in that particularly maddening way guilty men often are, as if his inability to repair what he had broken ought to win him sympathy. "I know how this looks," he began. She stared at him. "If you say that sentence to me again, I may actually hate you." He stopped. His throat moved as he swallowed. "I never meant for you to find out like this." The word struck her as so absurd, she almost felt calm. "You didn't mean for me to find out," she corrected. "The method is not the wound, Daniel." He sat down heavily in the nearest chair, suddenly looking older. "It started months ago. It was wrong. I know that. And yet you continued." "Yes. Did you love her?" He looked away. That was answer enough, but after a moment he said, "I don't know." Another lie. He rubbed a hand over his face. "I was unhappy, and so you decided to make two women miserable instead. That's not fair." She felt something harden inside her then, a clean and necessary hardness. "No," she said quietly. "What is not fair is standing in this room, asking fairness from the person you betrayed." He stood again, agitation overcoming shame. "What do you want me to say?" The question hung between them. What did she want? An apology could not become fidelity. An explanation could not become innocence. A confession could not make her unbelieving ears forget the exact tone in which he had said those 5 words. She wanted the last year back. She wanted the version of her life in which she had not been made into a fool. She wanted to feel safe enough to tell him about the baby and hear joy instead of calculation. But the thing about devastation is that it reveals desire by stripping away fantasy. What she wanted now was truth. Entire truth. However ugly. "How long?" she asked. He hesitated. "How long, Daniel?" 7 months. She nodded once. 7 months. More than half the time since summer. 7 months of dinners, holidays, shared beds, polite kisses, and ordinary conversations under which another life had been running like poison through water. And everyone knew except me? No, did anyone know? He said nothing. She looked at him until he answered. "My brother suspected." That somehow made it worse. "There is a particular humiliation in discovering that your tragedy has had an audience." "Wonderful," she whispered. "Absolutely wonderful." He took a step toward her again, more cautiously this time. "I ended it. When? 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. Exactly when she had discovered she was pregnant." The irony was almost theatrical. While she sat in a washroom, trying not to cry over a second pink line, he had apparently been deciding whether or not to end an affair. "And why?" she asked. "Why then?" He looked cornered again, and in that look she found the answer before he spoke it. Because she wanted more. Not because it was wrong. Not because he had remembered his vows. Not because he loved his wife. Because the other woman had asked to be chosen. Even now, even after exposure, he was not standing before her as a man transformed by conscience, only as a man trapped by escalation. The final thread snapped. Eliza felt suddenly, urgently tired, bone deep, beyond tears. She placed a hand on the back of the sofa to steady herself. Daniel noticed the movement. "You look pale. Sit down." It would have been almost comic, his instinctive concern arriving at the exact moment it ceased to matter. She let out a slow breath. This was not how she had wanted to tell him. Not in the aftermath of betrayal. Not in a room, still carrying the scent of another woman's perfume. But the truth rose in her, insistent, irreversible. Perhaps some part of her wanted to wound him. Perhaps some wiser part simply refused to carry the knowledge alone another hour. She met his eyes and said, "I'm pregnant." He stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he did not understand. "What?" "I'm 6 weeks pregnant." The silence that followed was unlike the earlier silences. It was vast. Daniel's face changed in stages. Confusion, disbelief, calculation, shock, and finally something like horror as the timing settled over him. He sat down without seeming to realize he had done so. Pregnant, he repeated, almost to himself. Yes. He looked at her stomach, though of course there was nothing yet to see. Why didn't you tell me? She laughed again, but this time the sound broke in the middle. I was trying to find a moment when my husband wasn't in love with someone else. He closed his eyes. The sentence hit its mark. When he opened them, they were wet. She had not seen him cry in years. Eliza, he whispered, I'm sorry. And there it was, the apology she had imagined wanting. But now that it had come, it felt terribly small. She believed he was sorry in that instant. Sorry for being found out. Sorry for the timing. Sorry that the child made everything morally uglier. Sorry in ways real enough to hurt him. But sorrow was not restoration. She felt no relief. Only a deeper grief for how late remorse always arrives. He stood and moved as if to kneel in front of her, then stopped when she recoiled. Please, he said. Please let me make this right. You cannot. I can try. That is no comfort to me. We're having a baby. The word we sounded monstrous to her suddenly. I'm having a baby, she said. Whether you are part of that is a question you should have considered before tonight. He looked as though she had struck him. Good. Some colder part of thought. Let him feel impact. Let him learn that hearts are not endlessly absorbent simply because women are taught to endure. What followed was not one conversation, but several, scattered through the longest night of her life. There were moments of accusation and moments of numbness. There were facts dragged into light against his will. Yes, there had been hotels. Yes, there had been messages. No, it had not only been physical. Yes, he had thought about leaving. No, he had not known how to do it without destroying his reputation. That last truth sickened her more than perhaps any other. Even at the edge of betrayal, he had been measuring damage to himself. She listened until listening became unbearable. At some point, she told him to sleep in the guest room. At some point, she locked the bedroom door after he left. At some point, the rain stopped, leaving the house unnaturally quiet, as if weather itself had retreated out of discomfort. She did not sleep. She sat curled in the armchair by the window, with a blanket around her shoulders, and watched darkness thin slowly toward dawn. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she simply stared. Once, just before morning, she laid both hands over her stomach and said aloud, I'm here. It was the first thing she had spoken directly to her child. Not a promise. Not a plea. A statement. I'm here. The simplicity of it steadied her more than anything else had. Because beneath all the ruin, one truth remained. Someone needed her. Someone innocent. Someone who had entered a world already cracked and would depend on her to choose what came next. By sunrise, Eliza did not yet know whether her marriage would survive, but she knew one thing with perfect certainty. She would not let this child grow in a house shaped by lies if she had any power to prevent it. The next morning, Daniel knocked softly on the bedroom door and asked whether she would see a doctor. The concern was practical now, almost desperate. Perhaps he feared she would lose the pregnancy from stress and that the loss would become another sin laid at his feet. Perhaps some newly awakened tenderness had genuinely broken through his self-absorption. She could not tell, and no longer wished to spend her life interpreting him. She agreed to see her doctor, but she did not let him drive her. Instead, she called her older sister, Hannah, whom she had not fully confided in for months because shame so often isolates the wounded before it heals them. Hannah arrived within an hour, took one look at Eliza's face, and said, Tell me everything. Eliza did. Not elegantly, not all at once, but enough. Hannah listened without interrupting, then held her as she wept in the passenger seat outside the clinic and said the sentence Eliza needed most. You do not have to decide today. The doctor was kind. The pregnancy appeared normal. Eliza was advised to rest, eat, avoid stress if possible. Avoid stress, as if catastrophe could be sidestepped by recommendation. She nearly laughed. Yet hearing the quiet, practical cadence of medical reassurance helped. There was a future after this day. There were appointments and vitamins and weeks and months. There would be a heartbeat soon. There would be decisions, yes, But life had not stopped at the point of betrayal. Life had stubbornly continued. She stayed with Hannah for several days. Daniel called, texted, emailed. Some messages she ignored. Some she read only once and then deleted. They ranged from apologies to explanations to promises of counseling, accountability, transparency, change. He said he had ended all contact with Marianne. He said he would do whatever was necessary. He said he loved her. That last declaration, arriving so conveniently after exposure, landed like ash. Love that appears only when threatened is difficult to trust. On the fourth day, Hannah found Eliza standing in the guest room with one hand over her stomach and asked the question no one else had asked plainly enough. Do you want to stay married to him? Eliza answered honestly. I don't know. That isn't the same as yes. No. Do you want the version of him you thought you had, or the actual man? The question was brutal, and because it was brutal, it was useful. Eliza sank onto the edge of the bed. I want not to have been put in this position. I know, but you were. For the first time since the hallway, Eliza let herself think beyond shock and into structure. What did reconciliation even mean? It could not mean returning. There was no return. There could only be a new thing built from truth or nothing built at all. And did she want to build with him? That answer remained hidden. But another answer was becoming clearer. She could no longer hand him the authority to define reality in their marriage. If anything were to continue, it would continue on terms shaped by honesty, consequence, and her freedom to leave at any point. A week later, she agreed to meet him in a counselor's office, not at home. Neutral ground mattered. Daniel looked thinner. He had shaved badly. His usual polish was gone. And for once he seemed not charmingly rumpled, but simply worn down by the weight of his own actions. In the presence of the counselor, words became harder for him to manipulate. He admitted what he had done. He admitted selfishness. He admitted that he had relied for years on Eliza's restraint to avoid facing difficult truths. He admitted that even before the affair, he had been emotionally absent and cowardly. Eliza listened. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes she did not. At one point, the counselor asked what she needed most in order to decide whether to continue the marriage. The answer came to her immediately. I need to see whether remorse in him can survive inconvenience, she said. Anyone can be sorry in a crisis. I need to know who he is when being honest costs him. Daniel looked at her with something like awe and grief combined, as if only now understanding the intelligence of the woman he had underestimated. Good, she thought again. Let him see me now. The months that followed were not simple and are often where stories lie in the wrong way. They like to skip from apology to healing as if pain were just a corridor and not a landscape. Eliza did not forgive quickly. She did not trust speeches. Daniel moved back into the guest room when she returned home because she had decided not to flee from a house she had helped build, but neither would she share a bed out of inertia. There were counseling sessions. There was access to phones, accounts, calendars. There were ugly conversations repeated because truth often has to be told more than once before it stops changing shape. There were days she looked at him across the kitchen and felt nothing but revulsion. There were other days, rarer but real, when she saw in his face a stripped-down humanity that had been missing for years and wondered whether damage had forced him into belated adulthood. Pregnancy moved forward, indifferent to marital philosophy. At 8 weeks, there was a heartbeat, rapid and miraculous, flickering on the screen like a secret trying to become song. Eliza cried at the sound. Daniel cried too. She did not lean into him, but she did not move away. At 12 weeks, the nausea eased. At 16, she began to show. At 20, they learned they were having a daughter. Daniel gripped the edge of the chair and lowered his head as if the knowledge had struck him with equal parts joy and unworthiness. Eliza watched him quietly. A daughter. The idea changed her calculations in ways she had not expected. She could forgive being wounded. Could she model self-betrayal? Never. If her daughter someday stood where she stood, what would Eliza beg her choose? Not endurance for its own sake. Not martyrdom mistaken for virtue. She would want her daughter to demand truth, respect, and safety. Therefore, she must do the same. Marianne never returned. There was one final message sent through the counselor confirming no contact and acknowledging the affair without excuse. Eliza did not answer it. Some doors do not require speeches when they close. By the 7th month, something unexpected had happened. Not restoration, not innocence, but the beginning of respect on new terms. Daniel had not become a hero, nor did Eliza become saintly. Some days, she still woke furious. Some nights, she still lay rigid when he sat beside her during late pregnancy discomfort, unsure whether accepting help was generosity or weakness. Yet he kept showing up, quietly, repeatedly. He attended appointments. He listened without defending himself when old pain resurfaced. He sold the share in the business arrangement that had kept Marianne adjacent to his life, though it cost him professionally. He told his brother the truth and endured the humiliation of it. He stopped asking when she would forgive him and started asking what accountability looked like that week, that day, that moment. For the first time in their marriage, effort was not something Eliza alone supplied. That did not erase what he had done. Nothing would, but it mattered. Labor began on a cold morning in November with a pain so sharp it stole all space for philosophy. Hannah drove her to the hospital because Eliza had demanded weeks earlier that her sister, not Daniel, be the guaranteed calm in the room. Daniel met them there, white-faced and breathless, and for 12 hours he did exactly what she needed and nothing more. No dramatics, no nerschop, just presence. Water, ice, pressure on her back, silence when silence helped, encouragement when she asked for it. Near the end, when pain blurred the edges of everything, Eliza gripped his wrist with bruising force, and he bent close. She thought for one wild second that she might say something unforgiving, something pulled from the ruins of that hallway months ago. Instead, what came out was rawer and stranger. "Don't fail her," she said. His eyes filled instantly. "I won't." When their daughter finally arrived, red-faced and furious and gloriously alive, the room changed around her. There are moments in life that do not erase what came before, but reorder it completely. Eliza held that tiny body against her chest and felt something beyond happiness. Something solemn and immense. Love without negotiation. Love that demanded courage rather than reward. Daniel stood beside the bed weeping openly, and when the nurse asked her daughter's name, Eliza answered, "Grace." It was not because she had become graceful about what happened. It was because grace, she had learned, was not softness. It was strength expressed without self-betrayal. It was survival without becoming cruel. It was the refusal to let someone else's failure poison the tenderness you still carried. The complete ending of their story was not decided in the delivery room, nor in the hallway, nor even in the months between. Endings, in real life, are often less theatrical than that. They are built by repeated choices. 1 year after Grace was born, Eliza and Daniel sat together in the nursery after putting their daughter to sleep. The house was quiet. Rain touched the windows again, gentler this time, and both of them heard the memory inside it. He said, "I know you could still leave me." She looked at the crib where their daughter slept, one tiny hand open beside her cheek. "Yes," she said. He nodded. "And if you ever do, I'll know why." It was the most honest sentence he had spoken in years. Eliza leaned back in the chair and let the silence settle. She thought of the woman she had been outside the drawing room door, one hand on the wall, the future breaking apart around her. She thought of the nights of rage, the doctor's office, Hannah's arms around her, the first heartbeat, the labor, the long months of watching actions instead of words. She thought of how close she had come to believing that being broken by someone meant you must remain broken. But that had never been true. At last she spoke. "I didn't stay because I couldn't bear to leave," she said. "I stayed because I wanted to see whether truth could live here after all. Because I wanted our daughter to grow up watching me choose with open eyes. If that ever changes, I will go. Not in secret, not in fear, and I will not apologize." He bowed his head. "You never should." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not innocence restored but a man permanently marked by what he had done, and perhaps made more human by being forced to face it. Some marriages, in the night betrayal, is exposed. Some should. Some continue in denial and become tombs with pretty curtains. Theirs did neither. It became something harder, less romantic, more honest. A marriage without illusions. A marriage that survived not because love was simple, but because truth, once dragged into the light, was finally made to stay there. Later that night, after Daniel had gone downstairs to wash the bottles, Eliza stood beside Grace's crib and watched her daughter sleep. The room glowed softly in the lamplight. Outside, the rain moved over the roof like memory, but it no longer sounded like doom. She placed a gentle hand over the crib rail and smiled through sudden tears. Once, not so long ago, she had stood alone in the dark and whispered, "I'm here." Now the promise had shape and breath and a tiny beating heart in a white cotton sleeper. She had been hiding a pregnancy when his words broke her first. She had thought that was the end of the story. It was not. The end, if there was one, was this. She did not disappear inside the wound. She did not let betrayal decide her worth. She did not mistake forgiveness for forgetting, nor endurance for love. She became a mother. She became braver. She became impossible to deceive in the old ways. And in the quiet nursery where her daughter slept safe at last, Eliza understood the truest thing pain had taught her. A woman can hear the worst words of her life behind a closed door and still walk forward carrying the beginning of something holy.